Welcome back to the channel. Today we are talking about one of the most celebrated and enduring films ever made, The Shawshank Redemption, released in 1994. This is a film that did not exactly set the box office on fire when it first came out, but over the decades it has quietly grown into something that almost every serious film lover holds close to their heart. As of today, it consistently holds the top spot on IMDb's list of the greatest films ever made, and that is not a position it earned by accident. It earned that through sheer emotional weight, extraordinary performances, and a story about the human spirit that never loses its power no matter how many times you watch it. The film was made in the United States of America. It is an American production, shot primarily at the Ohio State Reformatory in Mansfield, Ohio, which stands in brilliantly for the fictional Shawshank State Penitentiary in Maine. The story itself is adapted from a novella by Stephen King, a name most people associate with horror, but this particular work has nothing to do with monsters or supernatural terror. It is a quiet, deeply human story about friendship, patience, injustice, and the kind of hope that refuses to die no matter how brutal the circumstances surrounding it become. The film was written and directed by Frank Darabont, who had been trying for years to get this project made. He acquired the rights to Stephen King's novella for just $1, with King's blessing, and then spent considerable effort turning it into a screenplay and eventually a finished film. Castle Rock Entertainment produced it, and it was distributed by Columbia Pictures. The budget was approximately $25 million, a modest sum even for its time. And yet the result was something that most films made with 10 times that amount have never come close to achieving. Story. Plot details. The story begins in 1947. Andy Dufresne, a quiet and composed young banker from Portland, Maine, is convicted of murdering his wife and her lover, a crime he insists he did not commit. Despite his protestations, the evidence against him is circumstantial but compelling enough for the jury, and he is sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms at Shawshank State Penitentiary. Andy arrives at Shawshank and quickly discovers that life inside is governed by its own brutal set of rules. The warden, Samuel Norton, runs the prison with a Bible in one hand and corruption in the other. The guards, led by the sadistic Captain Byron Hadley, exercise their authority with violence and impunity. Gangs of inmates prey on the vulnerable. Andy, who comes across as detached and unreadable to those around him, initially seems like an easy target. But there is something beneath that composed exterior that most people cannot quite identify, a kind of quiet, iron-willed determination. It is through Ellis Boyd, Redding, a fellow inmate who has been inside for decades and who serves as the prison's informal supplier of contraband, that Andy slowly begins to find his footing. The 2 men develop a friendship that becomes the emotional core of the entire film. Red is a man who has made peace with the idea that he will die inside Shawshank. Andy, despite everything, never quite manages to make that peace. He continues to believe in something beyond those walls, and that belief, sometimes quiet, sometimes expressed in small and defiant acts, is what makes him so compelling to watch. Over the years, Andy makes himself useful in ways the prison administration cannot ignore. His background in banking leads him to assist guards and eventually the warden himself in managing finances, filing taxes, and, most importantly, laundering money. While doing this, he is also lobbying state authorities to improve the prison library, eventually building it into one of the finest in the state system. He mentors a young inmate named Tommy Williams, who may hold information that could prove Andy's innocence. When Tommy is murdered on Warden Norton's orders to keep that information buried, something shifts in Andy. He says nothing. He appears to accept it. But he has made a decision that the audience does not fully understand until the film's extraordinary final act. One morning, Andy is not in his cell. He has vanished. What follows is the revelation of one of cinema's most satisfying escape sequences, not spectacular in the action movie sense, but breathtaking in the sense of how methodical, patient, and quietly brilliant it is. Andy had spent nearly 20 years chipping away at his cell wall, concealing a tunnel behind a poster, and waiting. When he finally breaks free, he crawls through a sewage pipe and emerges into a rainstorm with his arms spread wide. The image is iconic. He then exposes the warden's corruption, ensures the accounts are seized, and disappears to a beach in Zihuatanejo, Mexico, a place he had described to Red years earlier as his dream. Red eventually earns parole after decades of failed attempts, largely because for the first time he speaks honestly about his past rather than saying what the board wants to hear. He finds Andy's message waiting for him beneath a rock in a field, along with bus fare and a little more. The film ends with Red walking across a beach toward his friend. Hope, as Andy once said, is a good thing. Maybe the best of things. And no good thing ever dies. Release date and background. The Shawshank Redemption had its limited theatrical release on September 23, 1994, in the United States. A wider release followed in October of the same year. The film performed disappointingly at the box office upon its initial release, earning roughly $16 million against its $25 million budget during its theatrical run. By any commercial measure, it looked like a misfire. However, the film received 7 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture, Best Actor for Morgan Freeman, Best Adapted Screenplay, Best Cinematography, Best Film Editing, Best Original Score, and Best Sound. It did not win any of those awards, competing that year against Forrest Gump, which dominated the ceremony, but the nominations brought it renewed attention. What truly transformed its reputation was its release on home video and later, repeated broadcasts on cable television. Audiences found it in their own time, at their own pace, and the film's emotional power translated perfectly to home viewing. Word of mouth built slowly and then unstoppably. By the early 2000s, it had become a genuine cultural phenomenon, and it has never really left that position since. The film was shot by cinematographer Roger Deakins, one of the finest directors of photography who has ever worked in cinema, and his contribution to the film's look, the warmth, the melancholy, the beauty of those wide exterior shots set against the grimness of the prison interior, is a large part of why it holds up so well visually even now, 3 decades later. Thomas Newman composed the score, which is gentle, aching, and perfectly matched to the film's emotional register. Trailer and media. Trailer information. The original theatrical trailer for The Shawshank Redemption is available on YouTube. You can search for it directly. It has been uploaded by Columbia Pictures and various official studio channels. The trailer does a reasonable job of conveying the film's tone and scale, though like many trailers from the early 1990s, it leans heavily on the more dramatic and action-oriented moments of a film that is, in reality, far more contemplative and character-driven than the trailer suggests. If you have never seen the film and are going in for the first time, the best advice is to trust the film itself rather than the marketing material around it. It rewards patience in a way that almost nothing else in mainstream cinema does. The film is currently available to stream on various platforms depending on your region. In many markets it is available on Netflix, Amazon Prime Video, and other services. The Blu-ray edition, which includes restored video and audio along with a making-of documentary, is widely regarded as the definitive home video presentation of the film, and is worth owning if you take the format seriously. Why it still matters. 30 years after its release, The Shawshank Redemption remains a film that people return to again and again, not for the plot, which they already know by heart, but for the feeling it produces. It is a film about what it means to hold on to something inside yourself when everything around you is designed to take it away. It is about friendship formed in the most unlikely of circumstances. It is about the slow, grinding, patient kind of courage that does not look like courage from the outside but turns out to be the most powerful kind there is. Frank Darabont made something that was never really about prison in the literal sense. He made a film about the walls that every person lives behind in one form or another, the walls that are built by circumstance, by other people's cruelty, by systems that grind down the individual, and about the quiet, persistent refusal to let those walls define what is possible. That is why it connects. That is why it has endured. And that is why, no matter how many times you watch it, the moment Andy Dufresne steps into that rain with his arms open feels like a release that belongs to you as much as it belongs to him. The story begins in the late 1940s, in the state of Maine. A young banker named Andy Dufresne sits in a parked car outside a house on a dark and rain-soaked night. Through the windshield, he watches his wife through the window of the house. She is inside with another man, Glenn Quinton, a golf pro with whom she has been having an affair. Andy drinks from a bottle of whiskey. On the passenger seat beside him lies a loaded revolver. The film cuts between this scene and a courtroom, where a prosecutor is laying out the evidence against him. Andy Dufresne, it is alleged, took that revolver and walked into that house and shot both his wife and her lover 4 times each, once for every bullet in the gun. Andy sits in the witness box and denies it. His manner is calm, almost unsettlingly so. He explains that he drove away that night without going inside. He threw the gun into the river. He made a decision not to do it. But the gun was never recovered. The bodies were found. The circumstantial evidence was damning. A jury deliberated and returned a verdict, guilty on both counts of murder in the first degree. The judge sentenced Andy Dufresne to 2 consecutive life terms at Shawshank State Penitentiary. As he is led away, his face reveals almost nothing. That controlled expression, that carefully maintained composure, will become one of the defining features of who Andy is and how the people around him learn, slowly and reluctantly, to understand him. Chapter 2. Arrival at Shawshank. The year is 1947. A bus pulls through the iron gates of Shawshank State Penitentiary. A group of new inmates step off, blinking in the hard light of the prison yard, surrounded by high stone walls and the sound of chains. Among the existing prisoners watching from above is Ellis Boyd Redding, known to everyone simply as Red. Red has already been inside Shawshank for many years, and in that time he has become the man who can get things, a small piece of contraband here, a comfort item there. He is the prison's informal broker, a man of considerable reputation and a kind of weathered dignity. He studies the new arrivals and places informal bets with his friends about which one will break down first on their first night. He places his bet on the slight, well-dressed, bespectacled young man near the end of the line, Andy Dufresne. Red will later reflect that he was wrong about that, and that it was one of the first times that Andy Dufresne made a fool of his assumptions. The first night inside Shawshank is brutal and ritualistic. The guards strip and hose down the new prisoners. Warden Samuel Norton, a lean, cold man with steel-rimmed glasses and a habit of quoting scripture, addresses the arrivals with a speech about discipline and the rules of his institution. He makes clear that the Lord's will is done in his prison and that any inmate who steps out of line will feel the consequences personally. The head guard, Captain Byron Hadley, stands beside him. Hadley is a man of casual and sudden violence, a bully with authority, and the inmates fear him with good reason. That very first night, one of the new prisoners breaks down and screams in his cell, overwhelmed by the reality of where he is. The guards come. Hadley beats him severely. The man dies of his injuries in the infirmary a few days later, and no one is held accountable. This is the world Andy has entered. In the early weeks, Andy keeps mostly to himself. He watches. He listens. He approaches Red in the yard one afternoon with a quiet confidence that surprises Red. Most new inmates do not approach him so directly. Andy asks if Red can get him a rock hammer. Not a full-sized one, he explains, a small one, the kind used by geologists and rock hobbyists. Andy tells Red he is a geology enthusiast who likes to carve and polish rocks. Red is immediately suspicious. A rock hammer, he points out, could be used as a weapon. Andy looks at him evenly and points out that it would take about 600 years to tunnel out of a prison with something that small. Red agrees to get it. He charges a fair price. A friendship, still nascent and cautious, begins. Chapter 3. Violence, Survival, and the First Signs of Andy. Life inside Shawshank settles into a grim routine. Andy is assigned to the laundry detail, working long hours in the steam and noise of the prison's washing facility. A gang of inmates led by a man named Boggs Diamond, predatory, organized, and protected by a culture of fear, takes an early interest in Andy. They target him repeatedly over the course of his first 2 years, attacking him in isolated corners of the prison. Andy fights back every time, which earns him beatings but also a reputation for being harder to break than he looks. He is hospitalized more than once. But he never gives in to what Boggs wants from him, and he never reports anything to the guards because reporting is its own form of death inside a place like Shawshank. The crisis with Boggs eventually reaches a turning point through an unlikely sequence of events. One summer afternoon, Andy is part of a crew tarring the roof of a prison building. He overhears Captain Hadley talking to 2 other guards, furious about an inheritance he has received from his brother, money he is afraid the government will take a large chunk of in taxes. The guards around him say nothing useful. Andy steps forward, calm as ever, and speaks to Hadley directly. The other inmates around him freeze. Speaking to Hadley uninvited is genuinely dangerous. But Andy offers to help Hadley keep every cent of that inheritance, legally, using a one-time gift exemption under tax law. All he asks in return is 3 beers each for himself and the men on the crew. Hadley grabs Andy by the collar, dangles him over the roof ledge, and looks as though he might drop him. Then something shifts. He asks Andy to explain further. Andy explains calmly. Hadley lets him down. A few weeks later, the roof crew sits in the afternoon sun drinking cold beers, feeling for a brief and surreal hour like free men. Red watches Andy sitting slightly apart from the others, not drinking his own beer, just squinting into the sunlight with a faint smile. Red reflects in his narration that he did not know what Andy was thinking in that moment. But he thinks Andy was feeling the warmth of the sun on his face and remembering what it was like to be someone who mattered in the world outside. Shortly after, Boggs Diamond is found beaten nearly to death in his cell, beaten by Hadley and the guards, quietly, in retaliation for the ongoing trouble he had caused around the prison. Boggs is transferred to a minimum security hospital and never returns to Shawshank. His gang, without their leader, dissolves. Andy is never bothered that way again. Chapter 4. The Library, the Music, and the Letters. Word of Andy's financial skills spreads. Before long he is doing tax returns for guards, then for their wives, then for the warden himself. He becomes something like a prison institution, the inmate who does your taxes, and this status comes with small but meaningful privileges, a private cell, protection from harassment, and a degree of autonomy unusual for a prisoner. It is a bargain that costs Andy something in terms of his dignity and his complicity in the corruption he is helping to manage, but he accepts it because it gives him space, and space is what he needs. Andy is assigned to assist the elderly prison librarian, Brooks Hatlin, a gentleman who has been inside since the 1920s and who has built the library into a modest but functional collection. Andy takes to the role with genuine enthusiasm. He sees in the library something that Shawshank has almost entirely driven out of its population, the possibility of the mind going somewhere other than where the body is trapped. He begins writing letters to the Maine state government requesting funds to expand the library's collection. He writes 1 letter per week. For 6 years, the letters go unanswered or receive polite but unhelpful responses. And he keeps writing. Eventually, rather than risk the ongoing embarrassment of his persistence, the state sends a one-time allocation of $200 and a box of donated books and records. Andy takes the allocation and, characteristically, turns it into something much larger over time. He writes 2 letters a week from that point on. One of the most resonant moments in the entire film comes during this period. A package of donated materials arrives at the library containing boxes of old records. Among them is a recording of a duet from a Mozart opera. Andy finds the record, and something in him responds to it with an intensity that overrides his usual careful restraint. He locks himself in the warden's office, the only room with a record player connected to the prison's public address system, and puts the needle on the record. The music, a female vocal duet of extraordinary beauty, flows out through the speakers across the entire prison yard. Every inmate stops. Every guard stops. The whole of Shawshank pauses for a few minutes while 2 women sing something that has nothing to do with prison walls or punishment, or the grinding weight of institutional life. Red, narrating, says that he could not tell you what the ladies were singing about. He likes to think it was something so beautiful it could not be expressed in words, and that it made every man who heard it feel free for a moment, free in a way that had nothing to do with the walls or the wire. Andy sits behind the locked door with his eyes closed, and a calm smile on his face. He knows what is coming. Hadley is outside, hammering at the door, screaming at him to open it. Andy does not hurry. The music plays to its end. He accepts 2 weeks in solitary confinement as the price, and when he emerges he tells Red it was the easiest time he ever did, because Mozart was in his head the whole time, and no one could take that away. Brooks Hatlin, the old librarian, is eventually granted parole. He has spent 50 years inside Shawshank, and the news does not fill him with joy. It fills him with terror. He briefly considers hurting a fellow inmate to guarantee his sentence is extended, just so he will not have to leave. Red and the others talk him out of it. Brooks goes out into the world. The film follows him with quiet, devastating attention as he tries and fails to find a place for himself in a world that has moved on completely without him. He works in a grocery store bagging food. He feeds a bird named Jake that had lived with him in the library. He writes letters back to his friends inside. The world outside is too loud, too fast, too indifferent. Brooks Hatlin hangs himself in the halfway house room, having carved his name into the wooden beam above his bunk. Red reads the letter aloud to the group in the yard. No one says very much. They all know what institutionalization means. They all know that the walls of Shawshank have a way of becoming the only walls a man can understand. Chapter 5. The Corruption of Warden Norton. As the years pass, Andy becomes increasingly entangled in Warden Norton's private enterprise. Norton runs a scheme he calls the Inside Man, essentially a prisoner labor contracting operation in which he undercuts legitimate construction bids by offering the state and private companies cheap inmate labor, skimming the difference for himself and distributing kickbacks to the politicians and officials who look the other way. The money needs to be laundered, and Andy, who understands finances and banking at a sophisticated level, is the instrument through which Norton does it. Andy creates a fictitious persona named Randall Stevens, opens accounts, and moves money through a system of deposits and withdrawals that is complex enough to confuse any auditor. He knows the system intimately because he built it. He also knows that knowing it puts him in a kind of danger that goes beyond the ordinary dangers of prison life. He is too useful to be released, and too dangerous to be allowed to simply walk away. Norton's relationship with Andy is a study in a particular kind of corrupt authority. He treats Andy with a surface courtesy that never quite conceals the absolute nature of the control he holds over him. He quotes scripture while committing crimes. He presents himself to the public and to state officials as a model of Christian rectitude. Inside Shawshank, he is simply a man who has found a comfortable arrangement and will do whatever is necessary to protect it. The Bible on his desk has a hollow interior. Inside that hollow, Andy will eventually place something that matters a great deal. Chapter 6. Tommy Williams and the Destroyed Hope. In the late 1960s, a young inmate named Tommy Williams arrives at Shawshank. Tommy is brash, uneducated, good-natured, and in some way that he himself does not entirely recognize, genuinely decent underneath the bravado. He has come through several other prisons and carries the habitual recidivism of someone who was never given much of a foundation. Andy takes to him. He spends time in the evenings helping Tommy prepare for his GED, his high school equivalency certificate, teaching him to read properly, working through mathematics and history and writing with him. Tommy responds to this attention with something close to devotion. He studies hard, sits the examination, and passes. It is one of the warmest and most hopeful sequences in the film, the two of them working through exercises by lamplight, Tommy getting something right and looking up with a pride he clearly does not know how to hold. But Tommy also brings something with him from his past that carries enormous consequences. In a previous institution, he had a cellmate who used to brag, in the particular way that certain criminals brag about accomplishments in front of an audience who cannot report them, about having killed a golfer and his lady friend in Maine and letting some other man take the fall for it. Tommy did not know the significance of this story at the time. But when he hears Andy's history, something clicks. He realizes, with genuine shock, that his old cellmate was describing the crime for which Andy Dufresne is serving 2 life sentences. The man's name was Elmo Blatch. Tommy is prepared to testify. He goes to Warden Norton with the information, excited, certain that this will set Andy free. Norton listens. He thanks Tommy. He tells him this is very serious, and needs to be handled carefully. Then he has Tommy placed in solitary for a period, and in the middle of the night he has Captain Hadley take Tommy into the yard and shoot him. The official story is that Tommy was shot while attempting to escape. No one is questioned. No investigation follows. Norton goes to Andy the next morning and tells him that Tommy was shot during an escape attempt. Andy sits across from him and says almost nothing. Norton makes clear, without saying so directly, that Andy is going nowhere, that he is too deeply embedded in the financial operation to be released, that if Andy causes any trouble he will ensure his life inside Shawshank becomes considerably worse, and that the Randall Stevens accounts will be shut down, taking the money with them. Andy returns to his cell. He seems, to those around him, to have finally and completely accepted that he will die in Shawshank. That night, Red notices that Andy seems different. He has a conversation with him in the yard that unsettles Red deeply. Andy talks about his dream, a place on the Pacific coast of Mexico, a town called Zihuatanejo, where he would like to have a small hotel on the beach. He would take his friends out on a boat. He would restore it himself. He would live simply and peacefully by the ocean. Red listens and tries to bring Andy back to reality, telling him that hope is a dangerous thing inside a place like this, that it can drive a man crazy. Andy looks at him and says something that Red will carry with him for years afterward, that it comes down to a simple choice, really. Get busy living, or get busy dying. The next morning, Andy is not in his cell. Chapter 7. The Escape. The discovery of Andy's absence sends Shawshank into controlled chaos. An alarm sounds. Guards sweep the prison. Captain Hadley is furious. Warden Norton storms to Andy's cell himself. On the wall hangs a large poster of Raquel Welch. Norton tears it down, and finds a hole in the wall behind it. A hole that goes all the way through to a drainage pipe. The warden is photographed standing there, staring into the hole, unable to fully process what he is looking at. The film then shows us, in one of cinema's most satisfying reverse revelation sequences, everything that Andy had been doing for the previous 19 years. From the very beginning, from the time he first arrived at Shawshank, Andy had been chipping at the wall of his cell with that small rock hammer. The rock hammer that Red had gotten him. The one that Red had noted would take 600 years to tunnel through a wall with. Andy had done it in 19. The walls of Shawshank, as it turned out, were made of inferior limestone, soft enough, over years and years of patient, quiet, nightly work, to be excavated by a determined man. Andy had hidden the debris inside his trousers and distributed it across the yard when he walked during the daily exercise period, shaking it out onto the ground through a small hole in his pocket. The posters on his wall, Rita Hayworth, then Marilyn Monroe, then Raquel Welch, had hidden the expanding tunnel behind them, each successive poster larger than the last as the tunnel grew. Andy had been working toward this moment for nearly 2 decades, night after night, in total silence and secrecy, never telling another soul. On the night of his escape, Andy waits until after a particularly violent storm has been underway for some time, knowing the thunder will cover the sound. He breaks through the final barrier into the drainage pipe. He crawls through 500 yards of pipe carrying the sewage of the entire prison. He emerges in a stream in a rainstorm outside the prison walls. He tears off his prison clothes. He stands in the downpour with his arms spread wide and his face turned up to the sky, and in that moment he looks like a man who has just been born. Red narrates that Andy Dufresne crawled through a river of filth and came out clean on the other side. And that is as close to a miracle as Red has ever personally witnessed. Before escaping, Andy had made several careful preparations. He had removed all the laundered money from the Randall Stevens accounts, transferring everything to a new account under that name before closing the old ones. He had packaged the financial records, evidence of Warden Norton's entire corruption scheme, along with a letter, and mailed them to the local newspaper from outside the prison on the morning after his escape, using clothes and an identity he had hidden years in advance. The next day, police arrive at Shawshank. Norton, confronted with the evidence and with the knowledge that he has been completely and methodically outmaneuvered by a man he kept in a cage for 19 years, retreats to his office. He takes his own life before the police can enter. Hadley is arrested. The corrupt administration of Shawshank collapses entirely. And somewhere far away, on a bus heading south, a man named Andy Dufresne, or perhaps Randall Stevens, is watching the landscape change outside the window. Chapter 8. Red's Parole and the Journey South. Red has appeared before the parole board many times over the decades. Each time, he has said the right things, expressed remorse in the practiced, carefully calibrated language of a man who has learned what the board wants to hear, and each time he has been denied. Something has always rung hollow in his presentations, something the board has sensed even if they could not name it. In the early 1970s, some years after Andy's escape, Red appears before the board again. He is an old man now. He is tired. And this time, for whatever reason, he does not perform. He is asked whether he has been rehabilitated. He says he does not know what the word means, that politicians and bureaucrats put that word on things, but he is not sure it has much to do with him or any man who has spent decades inside a place like Shawshank. He says that the young man who did the terrible thing he is in here for is long gone. He says he would like to talk to that young man and tell him some things, but he cannot because he does not exist anymore. He says that all he has left is this old man sitting here, who is tired. The board stamps his file. Parole granted. Red walks out of Shawshank into a world he barely recognizes. He takes a room in the same halfway house where Brooks once lived. He bags groceries at the same store. He sleeps badly and wakes up needing to ask permission to use the bathroom, out of habit that 20 years of conditioning has made almost involuntary. He thinks about Brooks. He understands completely, for the first time, exactly how Brooks felt and why he did what he did. Red has a moment, quiet and seriously rendered, in which the same possibility presents itself to him. He remembers Andy's voice. He makes a different choice. Andy had told Red years earlier that if he ever got out, he should go to a specific place, a particular field near the town of Buxton, Maine. He had described a long stone wall that runs along the north end of a field, near a large oak tree. He had said there was something buried there, under a volcanic rock that looks out of place among the others. Red goes. He finds the field. He walks along the wall. He finds the rock. Under it is a tin box. Inside the tin box is a letter from Andy, and enough money to keep Red going for a long while, and a set of instructions. Come south. Find me. Say Wataneo. Red violates his parole. He boards a bus. He watches the landscape of America slide past through the window and reflects that he hopes, and that the Pacific is as blue as it has been in his dreams. He has never seen the Pacific. He is afraid. But he is more afraid of becoming Brooks than he is of breaking a parole condition. He keeps going south. The film ends on a beach in Mexico. Red walks down toward the water. In the distance, a man is working on a boat, small, wooden, worn. He turns around. It is Andy. The two men walk toward each other. They meet. Neither says anything that we hear. They embrace. The camera pulls back into the wide blue sky above the water. The story is over. Red, in his final narration, says simply that he hopes he can make it across the border. He hopes to see his friend and shake his hand. He hopes the Pacific is as blue as it has been in his dreams. He hopes. Closing reflection. What the story is really about. The full story of the Shawshank Redemption is, on the surface, about a wrongly convicted man who escapes from prison. But that is not really what it is about. At its deepest level, it is a story about two kinds of people: those who, in the face of sustained and systematic cruelty, find a way to protect something essential inside themselves, and those who gradually surrender that essential thing because survival demands it. Andy Dufresne represents the first type. He is not a superhero. He suffers enormously during his years at Shawshank. He is beaten, isolated, used, and kept in prison for a crime he did not commit. But something in him, some core identity, remains untouched by all of it. He is still himself. The institution never fully gets inside him. Red represents the second type, or at least he begins there. He has been inside so long that Shawshank has become the only reality he can fully inhabit. He is wise, warm, admirable in countless ways, but he has, on some level, stopped imagining a different life for himself. Andy's presence, and Andy's friendship, and finally Andy's escape, all of it works on Red slowly, the way water works on stone, until by the end of the film Red too is capable of hope. He gets on that bus. He keeps going. That act, that small, frightened, determined act of a tired old man who has spent 40 years in prison choosing to keep moving forward, is the emotional climax of the entire film. The image of Andy on the beach is the reward. But Red getting there is the story. The Shawshank Redemption, actors' life histories. Detailed biographical accounts of the principal cast. Tim Robbins played Andy Dufresne. Timothy Francis Robbins was born on October 16, 1958, in West Covina, California. He was the son of Gil Robbins, a musician and folk singer who performed with a group called the Highwaymen, and Mary Ann Robbins, a homemaker. Growing up in a creative and somewhat unconventional household gave Tim an early exposure to the arts, and that environment left a permanent impression on how he would later approach his work as both an actor and a filmmaker. The family eventually moved to New York City when Tim was a child, and he grew up largely in Greenwich Village, which in the 1960s and 1970s was one of the most artistically alive neighborhoods in the United States. Tim attended UCLA, where he studied theater in the Department of Theater, Film, and Television, graduating in 1981. While still in college, he helped co-found a theater company called the Actors Gang, which became an important part of his life and remains so to this day. The Actors Gang was not a conventional commercial theater company. It was politically engaged, experimental in its methods, and committed to challenging its audiences rather than simply entertaining them. Robbins poured enormous energy into it, directing productions himself and performing in them, and the company grew into one of the more respected alternative theater groups in Los Angeles. He has never fully stepped away from it, even as his film career grew into something much larger. His early film career was modest and largely unremarkable. He appeared in small roles in various productions through the 1980s, picking up experience without breaking through. The role that changed things for him came in 1988 with Bull Durham, a baseball romantic comedy directed by Ron Shelton in which he played Ebby Calvin, Nuke, Lawless alongside Kevin Costner and Susan Sarandon. The film was a genuine hit, and Robbins's performance as the wild, talented, somewhat dim young pitcher was charming and funny in a way that showed real screen presence. It also led to one of the most significant personal developments of his life. He and Susan Sarandon began a relationship that would last for over 2 decades and produce 2 children together, even though the two never married. Through the late 1980s and early 1990s, Robbins continued building his career with increasingly interesting choices. He appeared in The Player in 1992, Robert Altman's darkly comedic satire of Hollywood, playing a studio executive who murders a screenwriter. It was a role that demonstrated a range beyond the likable comedic persona of Bull Durham and earned him serious critical attention. He also began directing at this point, Bob Roberts in 1992, a mockumentary he wrote and directed as well as starred in, about a right-wing folk-singing politician running for Senate. The film was sharp, politically aware, and confirmed that Robbins was not simply an actor looking for the next paycheck but someone with a genuine artistic point of view. The Shawshank Redemption arrived in 1994. Robbins had been chosen by director Frank Darabont after an extensive casting process, and his portrayal of Andy Dufresne became the defining performance of his career. The role required him to maintain an almost eerie emotional restraint across more than 2 hours of screen time, conveying enormous interior life through very controlled exterior means. It is a technically demanding kind of acting, the opposite of theatrical expressiveness, and Robbins brought it off with a completeness that few performers could have managed. The film's failure at the box office at the time of its release meant that the immediate rewards were muted, but as the film's reputation grew over the following years, so did recognition of what Robbins had achieved in it. In 2003, he received the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor for his role in Mystic River, directed by Clint Eastwood. He played Dave Boyle, a man haunted by childhood trauma whose life unravels in the wake of a murder investigation. It is an extraordinarily painful performance, raw in a way that is almost the inverse of Andy Dufresne, and it showed the full range of what Robbins was capable of as an actor. The Oscar was richly deserved and long overdue. His acceptance speech was notably political. He used the platform to speak about the Iraq War, which had begun that year, and it drew both applause and controversy, which was entirely consistent with who he is as a person. Robbins and Susan Sarandon separated in 2009 after 23 years together. He has continued to act steadily in the years since, appearing in films, television productions, and returning regularly to the theater. He remains deeply committed to the Actors Gang and has continued directing and performing through it. He is in his mid-60s now, still working, still politically vocal, and widely regarded as one of the more genuinely interesting figures in American cinema, an actor who has consistently chosen work that means something to him over work that would simply make him richer or more famous. Morgan Freeman played Ellis Boyd, Red Redding. Morgan Freeman was born on June 1, 1937, in Memphis, Tennessee. He was the son of Morgan Porterfield Freeman Sr., a barber, and Mamie Edna Freeman. The family was poor, and Freeman spent portions of his childhood living with his grandmother in Charleston, Mississippi. His early years were shaped by the particular hardships of black life in the American South during the late 1930s and 1940s, a period of legal segregation, deep poverty, and limited opportunity. That he managed to build the career he did from those beginnings is itself a remarkable story. Freeman showed an early aptitude for performance. He won a statewide drama competition at the age of 12 in Mississippi. He received a drama scholarship offer after completing high school but turned it down in favor of enlisting in the United States Air Force in 1955. He served as an airman mechanic and trained as a fighter pilot, though he never flew in combat. When he left the Air Force in 1959, he moved to Los Angeles, where he took odd jobs while studying acting. He then moved to New York City, where he studied at the Actors Studio and began finding work in theater and, eventually, television. The television work came first, most notably as a cast member on The Electric Company, a children's educational series that aired from 1971 to 1977, in which he played a variety of characters. It was steady, respectable work, and it kept him visible and employed through a period of his career in which major film roles were largely unavailable to black actors of his generation. He continued doing theater throughout this period, building a reputation in New York's theatrical community as a serious and gifted actor who had simply not yet found the role that would bring him the wider recognition he deserved. That recognition came late by Hollywood standards. Freeman was in his late 40s when his film career genuinely took off. Street Smart in 1987, in which he played a dangerous pimp named Fast Black, earned him his first Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor. The performance was a revelation, visceral, frightening, utterly committed, and it announced to the industry that here was an actor who could do something exceptional with serious material. Driving Miss Daisy followed in 1989, in which he played Hoke Colburn, the chauffeur to an elderly Jewish woman in Atlanta over several decades. The film won the Academy Award for Best Picture and Freeman received his first nomination for Best Actor. The role required enormous subtlety and dignity, and Freeman brought both in full measure. The Shawshank Redemption in 1994 gave Freeman the role of Red, and it is arguably the performance that defined him in the public imagination more than any other. The narration alone, that deep, measured, wise voice guiding the audience through the story, became one of the most recognized and beloved elements of the film. Freeman brought to Red a quality that is very difficult to manufacture, the sense of a man who has genuinely lived, who has known real suffering and real regret, and who has arrived at a kind of hard-won peace with it. It earned him another Academy Award nomination for Best Actor, his second in that category. He did not win, but the nomination cemented his status as one of the great actors of his generation. He finally received the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor in 2005 for $1 Million Baby, directed by Clint Eastwood. He played Eddie Scrap Iron Dupreez, a former boxer-turned-gym assistant who narrates the story of a female boxer's rise and tragedy. It was his fourth nomination and his first win, and it was greeted by the industry as a long-overdue recognition. Through the late 1990s and 2000s, Freeman appeared in an extraordinary range of films, Say Seven in, Amistad, The Dark Knight Trilogy, Bruce Almighty, Invictus, among many others, cementing his reputation as one of the most reliable and consistently excellent actors working in American cinema. His personal life has been complicated. He was married twice, first to Jeanette Adair Bradshaw from 1967 to 1979, and then to Myrna Colley Lee from 1984 to 2010. In 2018, multiple women made allegations of inappropriate behavior against him, which he addressed with a public statement that expressed regret for any discomfort he had caused while denying some of the specific allegations. He has continued to work through his mid-80s and remains one of the most recognizable voices and faces in global cinema. He has been open in interviews about his passion for flying, he is a licensed private pilot, and about his love for his home state of Mississippi, to which he returned and where he has lived for many years. He owns a restaurant and a blues club in Clarksdale, Mississippi, the city widely considered the birthplace of the blues, and his presence there has helped revitalize interest in the region. Bob Gunton played Warden Samuel Norton. Robert Patrick Gunton Jr. was born on November 15, 1945, in Santa Monica, California. He grew up in a military family, His father was a career officer, which meant a childhood of frequent relocations and adaptations to new environments. This kind of upbringing tends to produce either very rigid or very adaptable people, and in Gunton's case it seems to have contributed to a performer with considerable range and a particular skill for playing authority figures, people of power, and characters whose formal exterior conceals something more troubling underneath. He studied at the University of California, Irvine, and then went on to develop his career primarily through the theater, where he built a substantial reputation before transitioning to film and television. His Broadway career was extensive and genuinely distinguished. He appeared in major productions over several decades and earned a Tony Award nomination for Best Actor in a Musical for his performance as Juan Perón in Evita, which had its Broadway run beginning in 1979. The role required him to convey the authoritarian magnetism and political cunning of one of the 20th century's most controversial figures, and the performance was widely praised. It was the kind of work that established him as a serious stage performer with real presence and command. Film and television came somewhat later. When he was cast as Warden Norton in The Shawshank Redemption in 1994, he was already a man of considerable experience in his late 40s. The role suited him almost perfectly. Norton is a man who uses the language of Christian virtue as a mask for corruption and cruelty, and Gunton played that particular hypocrisy with quiet, chilling precision. The character never raises his voice more than necessary. He does not need to. His authority is absolute, and he knows it, and Gunton conveyed that without any of the theatrical indicators that lesser actors might have reached for. It is one of the more perfectly calibrated villain performances in mainstream American cinema of the 1990s. He continued working steadily after Shawshank in both film and television, often in similar roles: officials, administrators, antagonists with formal power. His television appearances include significant recurring or guest roles in 24, Patch Adams, Broken Arrow, and many other productions. He has remained active in his later years and is still recognized and remembered primarily, by most audiences, as the warden who stood in front of that hole in the wall and could not believe what he was seeing. Clancy Brown played Captain Byron Hadley. Clarence John Brown III, known professionally as Clancy Brown, was born on January 5, 1959, in Urbana, Ohio. He grew up in a family with deep roots in Ohio political and civic life. His father was a lawyer and a politician who served in the United States Congress and later as a newspaper publisher. That background gave Brown a childhood that was comfortable and connected to public life in ways that many of his peers were not. He studied at Northwestern University in Illinois, where he was involved in theater and began developing the performance skills that would underpin his long career. Brown stands 6 feet 3 inches tall and has a physical presence, large, broad-shouldered, with a voice of considerable depth and authority, that has shaped the kinds of roles he has been offered throughout his career. He made his film debut in Bad Boys in 1983, and then appeared in a role that made a significant impression on audiences of a certain generation, the villain Kurgan in Highlander in 1986, a near-immortal warrior of terrifying brutality. The Kurgan remains one of the great screen villains of 1980s fantasy cinema, and Brown threw himself into the role with evident relish, creating a character who was simultaneously cartoonish in his evil and genuinely menacing. Captain Hadley in The Shawshank Redemption was a different kind of villain, less theatrical, more mundane, and in some ways more disturbing for it. Hadley is not a monster in the grand cinematic sense. He is simply a man with power over people who cannot fight back, and he uses that power carelessly and cruelly because there are no consequences to doing so. Brown played that institutional violence with a matter-of-fact quality that made it land with particular force. The scene in which he beats a new prisoner to death on his first night is rendered without any of the stylized qualities of movie violence. It is just ugly and quick and followed by silence, the way real institutional violence tends to be. Beyond his live-action work, Brown has had an extraordinarily prolific and successful career as a voice actor. He is perhaps best known to younger generations as the voice of Mr. Krabs in SpongeBob SquarePants, a role he has held since the show's debut in 1999, and which represents a remarkable contrast with the physical menace of many of his on-screen performances. He has also voiced characters in video games, animated series, and countless other productions. His voice work demonstrates the full range of a performer who might, on the basis of his appearance alone, be categorized narrowly as a heavy or a villain, but who is in reality a versatile and technically skilled actor capable of enormous warmth and comedy as well as threat. James Whitmore played Brooks Hatlin. James Allen Whitmore Jr. was born on October 1, 1921, in White Plains, New York. He grew up in a middle-class household and attended Yale University, where he studied drama. His education was interrupted by World War II, during which he served in the United States Marine Corps. He returned from the war, completed his education, and began his professional acting career in the late 1940s, arriving at a moment in American theater and film that was rich with opportunity for serious dramatic actors. He established himself quickly. His Broadway debut was significant. He appeared in Command Decision in 1947 and received immediate recognition. His early film work brought him an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor for his role in Battleground in 1949, just 2 years into his film career. That kind of immediate recognition was a sign of a genuine talent, a performer with something distinctive and authentic that audiences and critics could identify even when he was playing secondary roles. Whitmore worked steadily through the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s in films and television, building a body of work that was consistently solid without ever making him a major star in the conventional sense. He was always valued more as a craftsman and a character actor than as a leading man, and he appeared comfortable with that identity. He did celebrated one-man shows over the years, including a celebrated portrayal of President Harry Truman in Give 'Em Hell, Harry, which was filmed for theatrical release in 1975 and for which he received an Academy Award nomination for Best Actor. The performance was widely praised and demonstrated his ability to sustain a solo stage performance at the highest level. His role as Brooks Hatlin in The Shawshank Redemption came when he was in his early 70s, and it is a relatively brief but extraordinarily affecting performance. Brooks is a man so thoroughly institutionalized that freedom has become more frightening to him than imprisonment. Whitmore played that psychological reality with a gentleness and a specificity that made the character's eventual fate one of the most genuinely sad moments in the film. He had the kind of weathered, lived-in quality that comes from decades of experience, and it served the role perfectly. You believed absolutely that this was a man who had been inside for 50 years and had, somewhere along the way, lost the ability to imagine being anywhere else. Whitmore continued working until shortly before his death on February 6, 2009, at the age of 87. Gil Bellows played Tommy Williams. Gil Bellows was born on June 28, 1967, in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. He trained at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in Los Angeles and began his professional acting career in the early 1990s. His background was in theater, and he brought to his early film and television roles the kind of physical commitment and emotional openness that stage training tends to develop. Tommy Williams in The Shawshank Redemption was one of his earliest significant film roles, and he played the character with an appealing mix of rough edges and genuine sweetness that made Tommy's fate land with particular emotional force. Tommy is not a sophisticated character. He is impulsive, undereducated, and has been cycling in and out of trouble his whole life, but there is something fundamentally decent in him, and Bellows found that decency without sentimentalizing it. The scenes between Tommy and Andy, as Andy tutors him through his GED preparation, have a warmth and authenticity that depend entirely on Bellows being as good as he is. A lesser performance would have made Tommy a convenient plot device. Bellows made him a person. Following Shawshank, Bellows became best known to television audiences for his long-running role as Billy Thomas in Ally McBeal, the legal comedy drama that ran from 1997 to 2002. The show was enormously popular during its run, and Bellows was a significant part of its ensemble, playing a character navigating the complicated emotional terrain of working alongside his ex-girlfriend. He has continued to work in film and television since Ally McBeal ended, primarily in Canada and in American productions, and remains well regarded within the industry as a dependable and skilled performer. William Sadler played Haywood. William Thomas Sadler was born on April 13, 1950, in Buffalo, New York. He attended the Hart College of Music at the University of Hartford and later studied at Cornell University's theater program, from which he graduated. Like many serious actors of his generation, he built his foundation in the theater before transitioning to film and television, and his training gave him the technical groundwork to sustain a long and varied career. Sadler has worked almost continuously since the late 1970s across an extraordinary range of roles. He is perhaps most recognizable from his appearances in the Die Hard franchise. He played Stuart in Die Hard 2 in 1990, and from his portrayal of Death in Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey in 1991, a comedic role in which a skeletal, game-playing Death is hustled by two-time traveling heavy metal enthusiasts in a series of games. The performance was memorably funny and showed a willingness to be genuinely silly that not every serious dramatic actor possesses. He also appeared in The Green Mile, another Frank Darabont adaptation of a Stephen King story, as well as in television series including Roswell and Boardwalk Empire. In The Shawshank Redemption, Haywood is a supporting role within Red's circle of long-term inmates, comic relief in places, but also part of the texture of the prison community that the film builds so carefully. Sadler played him with the naturalness of someone completely comfortable with ensemble work, never pushing for attention but always present and grounded. That kind of reliable, unpretentious supporting work is rarer and more valuable than it is usually given credit for, and it contributes more to a film's overall quality than audiences tend to notice consciously. The choice of location was partly driven by this financial reality. The Ohio State Reformatory in Mansfield, Ohio, was selected as the primary filming location because it was available, it was genuinely atmospheric, and it was considerably cheaper to use than alternatives. The reformatory had been closed and was slated for demolition. The production company negotiated with the local authorities to delay that demolition by 1 year so that filming could take place. This was an unusual arrangement, essentially a race against the wrecking ball, and it gave the entire production a sense of urgency that was not entirely artificial. They were working inside a building that was scheduled to be torn down, and they needed to get everything done before that happened. After filming wrapped, most of the complex was indeed demolished. The cell block and main administrative building were preserved for historical purposes, and they still attract visitors today. The budget also forced creative compromises in specific scenes. One notable example involves the movie that the inmates watch in the prison yard, that famous outdoor screening scene. The original script called for them to be watching The Lost Weekend, the 1945 Billy Wilder film about alcoholism. The production team went to Paramount Pictures to license the footage and discovered it was too expensive. They went back to Columbia Pictures, which held the domestic distribution rights for Shawshank itself, and asked for a list of cheaper options. One of the titles on that list was Gilda, the 1946 Rita Hayworth picture. Given that Rita Hayworth was already part of the film's DNA, her poster was on Andy's wall, the choice of Gilda was not just a budget compromise but a genuinely better creative decision. The budget limitation accidentally produced a more resonant choice. Similarly, when a rented ambulance on set broke down during filming, the production did not have the money to simply replace it on short notice. The crew had to improvise around the problem, which created delays and added pressure to an already demanding schedule. principal photography was taking place over 3 months, June through August of 1993, in conditions that frequently required workdays of up to 18 hours, 6 days a week. The reformatory in Ohio was not air-conditioned and the summer heat was significant. Cast and crew were working long days in a hot, physically uncomfortable environment with a budget that left little room for delays. The financial pressure was constant and real, and everyone on set felt it. The film's original theatrical release in September 1994 earned approximately $16 million against that $25 million budget, a number that did not include marketing costs or the cinema's own percentage of ticket sales. By any commercial measure, it was a financial disappointment. Castle Rock had invested $25 million and gotten back considerably less. The film closed after 10 weeks. It was not until the 7 Academy Award nominations were announced in early 1995 that it was re-released and earned a further $12 million, bringing the domestic total to approximately $28 million. The real financial recovery came through home video. It became the most rented video of 1995, which began the long process of the film recouping its costs and eventually turning a healthy profit through television licensing and repeated broadcast. The lesson the industry drew from Shawshank's financial trajectory was, in retrospect, one of the more important lessons of that decade. Box office performance at initial release is not the only measure of a film's commercial value, and a genuinely good film can find its audience through other channels if given enough time. Stephen King's $5,000 check, and what he did with it. The story of how the film rights were acquired is one of the funnier and more touching backstory elements of the entire production. Darabont paid King $5,000 for the rights to the novella in 1987. King took the check. Years passed. The film got made. It flopped at the box office. Then the nominations came in, then the home video success, then the slow-building cultural phenomenon. By the time it became clear that The Shawshank Redemption was going to be one of those films that people never stopped watching, Stephen King had a thought about that $5,000 check sitting somewhere in his finances. He went and found it. He had never cashed it, and he had it framed. Then he sent it back to Frank Darabont with a note attached. The note said simply, "In case you ever need bail money. Love, Steve." Darabont has spoken about this in interviews with evident warmth. It is the kind of gesture that says more about a person's character than almost anything else could, and it gives you a sense of why the collaboration between King and Darabont produced such good work. The man who auditioned for a role that did not exist. When Frank Darabont removed Rita Hayworth's name from the full title of King's novella, the original title was Rita Hayworth and The Shawshank Redemption. He did so because he was worried people would think the film was a biopic of the actress. He was right to worry. Even with the shortened title, the production office began receiving calls from agents representing actresses who wanted to audition for the role of Rita Hayworth, a character who does not appear in the film at all. Rita Hayworth exists in the story only as a poster on a wall. She is not a speaking character. She is not even a character. She is a piece of paper with a famous face on it. This did not stop a steady stream of calls from people who had apparently not read past the title, or possibly not read the title either. The most spectacular version of this confusion involved a supermodel's agent who called Darabont personally. The agent told him, with enormous confidence, that he had read the script, the best script he had ever encountered, he said, and that his client would be absolutely perfect for the part of Rita Hayworth. The statement revealed, in one breath, that the agent had either not read the script at all or had read it, and somehow missed the fact that Rita Hayworth does not appear in it as a character. Darabont has told this story in multiple interviews with the kind of weary amusement of someone who has had to explain, repeatedly, to people in a position of professional responsibility that the part they were calling about did not exist. But even more memorable than the agent's call was the fact that, at open casting calls, actual people physically showed up at the studio hoping to read for the role of Rita Hayworth. One of those people was a man. in drag clothing, ready to play Rita Hayworth. In a film in which Rita Hayworth is a poster, Morgan Freeman threw a baseball for 9 hours straight. The scene early in the film where Andy and Red have their first real conversation in the prison yard, Red tossing a baseball back and forth while they talk, is one of the most quietly accomplished scenes in the film. It looks effortless. It looks like two old friends chatting on a warm afternoon. It took 9 hours to shoot. Frank Darabont is famously demanding about repeated takes, and he was not satisfied with the scene until he had run through it a very large number of times across a very long day. Morgan Freeman threw that baseball for the entire 9 hours. He did not complain. He did not stop. He showed up the next morning for work with his left arm in a sling. He had damaged his arm from the repetitive motion of throwing for 9 consecutive hours, and he arrived on set the next day unable to use it properly. The crew noticed. The story circulated. It became one of those behind-the-scenes legends that defines what a particular set was like. In this case, a set where the director's standards were very high, and where the actors met those standards even at personal physical cost, without making a fuss about it. Tim Robbins spent time in actual solitary confinement. When Andy Dufresne is sent to solitary confinement in the film, a punishment he receives more than once, Tim Robbins needed to understand what that experience felt like from the inside. He asked to be placed in the actual solitary confinement cell at the Ohio State Reformatory. The cell was small, dark, and airless in the way that solitary confinement cells are designed to be. Robbins went in. He lasted somewhere between 1 and 2 hours before he came back out and said, quietly but firmly, that was enough. He had gotten what he needed. Frank Darabont later noted that Robbins was not exaggerating about the experience being difficult. The cell was genuinely oppressive in ways that even a brief stay made viscerally clear. The moment has a dark humor to it when you consider that the entire scene involved a man voluntarily locking himself in a prison cell to understand what it felt like to be involuntarily locked in a prison cell, and then coming out after 2 hours while his character was kept there for weeks at a time. Robbins himself acknowledged the irony. He was not entirely sure, after those 2 hours, how a person was supposed to survive weeks in that darkness without going somewhere very bad inside their own mind. The escape scene was shot in real cow manure. The escape sequence, the moment when Andy crawls through the sewage pipe and emerges into the rainstorm, arms wide free, is one of the most iconic images in American cinema. It is a moment of pure cinematic joy. It is also the moment in which Tim Robbins was standing in a creek filled with actual cow manure. The location in Ohio was farm country, and the small creek used for the scene was not, by any stretch, a clean body of water. It was, as Robbins himself described it at the film's 20th anniversary reunion, cow country. The creek was full of what farm creeks in cow country tend to be full of. The production team had to dam the creek to get the water level high enough for the scene to work visually. Then they poured sterilizing chemicals into the water to try to reduce the risk of Robbins contracting some kind of disease from standing in it. They could not make the water clean. They could only make it slightly less dangerous. Darabont later described the situation with a mixture of admiration and horror. Here was this glorious, soul-lifting cinematic moment, arms outstretched, rain falling, a man reborn, and the actor at the center of it was drenched in chemically treated cow urine and manure. Robbins did it without a stunt double. He did it multiple times for different camera angles. He came out the other side of the shoot visibly relieved to be done with that particular location. The irony that Red's narration in that scene describes Andy crawling through a river of filth and coming out clean on the other side was not lost on anyone who knew what Robbins had actually been standing in. On screen, he comes out clean. In reality, no amount of sterilizing solution was going to make anyone feel entirely clean after that experience. Robbins joked about it at the reunion screening, saying simply, "It was cow country," with the kind of resigned expression of a man who has accepted, over 20 years, that this will be a part of every interview he ever does about the film for the rest of his life. Morgan Freeman's narration had to be recorded twice. One of the most distinctive elements of The Shawshank Redemption is Morgan Freeman's narration, that deep, measured, unrushed voice that guides the audience through decades of Andy's story. What most people do not know is that the narration almost did not sound the way it does in the finished film, because of a technical problem that was not discovered until after all filming was complete. Darabont had made the unusual decision to record the narration before filming began, rather than after, so that it could be played on set during shooting to help establish the rhythm and pacing of each scene. Freeman recorded the entire narration in a studio in Iowa in a single session that lasted approximately 40 minutes. It was efficient, it was useful during production, and it sounded exactly right. Then the sound engineers in Los Angeles listened back to the recording and found a tape hiss running through it, a background noise they could not remove without compromising the audio quality of the narration itself. The recording, after all the work that had gone into it, and all the ways it had been used during production, was not usable for the final film. Freeman had to come back and record the entire narration again, in a proper studio, to the finished edited film rather than to the script alone. This second recording session took 3 weeks. Not 40 minutes. 3 weeks. Darabont has spoken about this in the film's commentary, and while he does not use the word catastrophic, the implication is that discovering an unusable recording of something as central as the film's narration, after all filming is complete, is one of those production problems that makes a director's hair go slightly grayer overnight. The movie title confused everyone, including the actor's own fans. At the film's 20th anniversary reunion, hosted by the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, Morgan Freeman and Tim Robbins compared notes on the various ways fans had mangled the title of the film over the years. Freeman noted that even at the time of its original release he had been puzzled by the choice of title, saying that nobody could actually say it properly. The film's poor initial box office performance was attributed by several people, including Freeman himself, partly to the fact that the title was simply too difficult for audiences to hold in their heads or repeat to friends. It did not help that the word Shawshank means nothing to most people outside the context of the film itself. The cast and director shared with the audience at the reunion the various versions of the title they had heard from confused fans over the years. These included the Shawshank Redemption, the Shawshank Redemption. Tim Robbins recalled hearing that one directly from a fan who was trying to recommend the film to someone else, and several other variations that bore diminishing resemblance to the actual title. Robbins joked that the film's eventual cultural dominance was achieved entirely in spite of the fact that a significant portion of its audience could not reliably remember what it was called. Freeman suggested that this was, in retrospect, proof that a good film will find its audience through word of mouth, even when that word of mouth involves people telling their friends to watch a movie called The Shawshank Redemption. Brooks never actually left the prison, even in the film. The Brooks-Hatland sequence, in which the elderly librarian is released on parole after 50 years and tries and fails to find a place for himself in the outside world, is one of the most emotionally devastating stretches of the film. It is set in a halfway house, in a small room, in a world that Brooks cannot navigate anymore. The whole point of the sequence is that Brooks has been away from the outside world for so long that freedom has become more frightening than imprisonment. There is a dark irony embedded in the production design of this sequence that audiences never knew about, and when it became public it added an extra layer of meaning to what was already an extraordinarily affecting piece of filmmaking. The room in the halfway house where Brooks spends his final days and eventually carves his name into the wood above his bunk, that room was not a separate location. It was an office inside the Ohio State Reformatory. The same building. The same institution. Brooks-Hatland, on screen, was shown leaving Shawshank and entering the outside world. In reality, the actor never left the building. On some level, either did Brooks. The production's budget limitations and the practical convenience of using existing spaces within the reformatory accidentally created one of the most quietly resonant pieces of location irony in the entire film. He thought he was free. The camera thought he was free. He was still inside. It was Morgan Freeman who suggested Tim Robbins for the lead role. Darabont had been struggling to cast the role of Andy Dufresne. The character required a very specific quality, that controlled, slightly unknowable composure, and finding an actor who could sustain that across more than 2 hours of screen time without making the character cold or unsympathetic was proving difficult. Several major names had circled the project. Tom Hanks was considered. Tom Cruise expressed interest but withdrew when he discovered that Rob Reiner, who had offered Darabont $2.5 million for the script, would not be heavily involved as a director. Kevin Costner was considered. Brad Pitt was cast in the role of Tommy but dropped out when Thelma and Louise came out, and suddenly made him considerably more famous than he had been when he committed to the project. James Gandolfini said no to the role of Boggs Diamond to take a part in True Romance. The casting process was complicated by the film's relatively modest budget, and the fact that the most famous names interested in it had conditions that the production could not always meet. It was Morgan Freeman, once he was on board as Red, who looked at the situation and suggested Tim Robbins. Darabont went back and watched Jacob's Ladder, the 1990 psychological thriller in which Robbins plays a Vietnam veteran haunted by visions and hallucinations. He watched it, and understood immediately why Freeman had suggested him. There was something in Robbins's quality as a performer, a stillness, a sense of interior depth that did not require constant expression, that matched exactly what Andy Dufresne needed to be. Darabont cast him. The two men built a genuine friendship during production, which Darabont has noted was essential to the film's success. The friendship between Andy and Red on screen was grounded in a real warmth and trust between Robbins and Freeman that developed naturally over the course of the shoot. It is the kind of thing you cannot manufacture in post-production, and it shows in every scene they share. Tim Robbins turned up the volume, and no one had written that into the script. The Mozart scene, in which Andy locks himself in the warden's office and plays the Marriage of Figaro over the prison's public address system, is one of the most celebrated sequences in the film. The script called for Andy to play the record. What the script did not call for was what happens next, when Norton begins hammering on the door and shouting at Andy to turn the music off. Andy instead reaches over and turns the volume up. That moment of quiet, smiling defiance, that small act of turning the dial in the wrong direction, is one of the most perfect character moments in the entire film. Tim Robbins improvised it. It was not in the script. He made the decision in the moment that this is what Andy would do, and he was right. Darabont kept it. The finished film would be meaningfully less without it, because it captures something essential about who Andy is, a man who, when given the choice between compliance and one final moment of resistance before accepting the consequences, will always choose the moment of resistance, however small. The Shawshank Redemption, Cultural and Historical Details. A deep account of the film's historical roots, cultural meaning, and lasting legacy. The historical world the film is set in. The Shawshank Redemption is set across a span of roughly 27 years, beginning in 1947 and running through to the early 1970s. To understand the film fully, it is necessary to understand what America looked like during those decades, because the world outside the prison walls, and the systems that built and sustained a place like Shawshank, was shaped by very specific historical forces that the film quietly absorbs into its texture, even when it does not address them directly. The story opens in 1947, just 2 years after the end of World War II. America in 1947 was a country in the middle of a profound transition. Millions of veterans had returned home after years of combat, and the nation was attempting to rebuild its domestic life around the post-war prosperity that was real but unevenly distributed. The American criminal justice system of this period was deeply conservative in its philosophy and largely unreformed in its practice. Prisons were not discussed publicly as places of rehabilitation. They were understood, by government and by public opinion alike, as places of punishment, and the conditions inside them were rarely subject to serious scrutiny from outside. There was no meaningful organized prisoners' rights movement in 1947. There were no federal oversight mechanisms of any real power. What happened inside a state penitentiary was largely the business of the warden who ran it, and wardens with the authority and inclination to exploit their inmates, financially, physically, or otherwise, operated in an environment where the consequences for doing so were minimal. This is the world that produced Warden Samuel Norton. He is not a historical figure, but he is a historically accurate type, the institutional administrator whose personal corruption is protected by the structural indifference of the system around him. The use of prison labor for private financial gain, which Norton practices throughout the film, was not a fictional invention. Convict leasing, the practice of contracting incarcerated people as cheap or free labor for private businesses and public projects, had deep historical roots in American life going back to the period following the Civil War, when it was used primarily and systematically against newly freed Black Americans in the South. By the 1940s and 1950s, the formal system of convict leasing had been largely dismantled in most states, but the underlying practice of exploiting prison labor for the benefit of administrators, contractors, and state budgets continued in various forms. Norton's scheme in the film, undercutting legitimate construction bids with essentially free inmate labor and pocketing the difference, is the mid-20th century version of a practice with very old and very ugly roots in American economic and racial history. The film's setting also places it against the backdrop of the early Cold War period, McCarthyism, and the broader cultural conservatism of 1950s America. These are not themes the film addresses directly, but they form the atmosphere of the era it depicts. The 1950s in America were, culturally, a period of enforced conformity and deep suspicion of individual nonconformity. The idea of a man who refused to break, who maintained his own interior life against the pressure of an institution designed to flatten and absorb individual identity, carries a particular resonance against that historical moment. Andy Dufresne, with his rock collection and his music and his carefully maintained sense of self, is in some ways a figure of private resistance to the same forces of institutional conformity that shaped American public life in that decade. The story moves through the 1960s as well, a period of enormous social upheaval in America, with the civil rights movement, Vietnam War protests, and countercultural challenges to established authority reshaping the country's self-understanding. The prisoners of Shawshank exist largely outside these transformations, watching the decades pass from inside walls that change very little. The world outside is convulsed by questions of justice, freedom, and the rights of those the system has marginalized. Inside Shawshank, those same questions are alive in intensely personal and immediate form, stripped of their ideological framing. The film does not draw these connections explicitly, but they are present in the historical texture of the story's timeline. The real prison behind the fiction. The Ohio State Reformatory in Mansfield, Ohio, which served as the filming location for Shawshank State Penitentiary, is itself a building with a significant and troubling history. The reformatory was opened in 1896, designed in a Romanesque and Gothic Revival architectural style that was intended to inspire in its inmates a sense of moral gravity and institutional authority. It was built during a period when prison reform movements in America were arguing, without much practical success, that prisons should be places of genuine rehabilitation rather than pure punishment. The Gothic architecture was meant to express that aspiration. The reality inside the institution, over the century of its operation, was considerably less noble. The Ohio State Reformatory housed some of the most overcrowded and inhumane conditions of any state prison in the Midwest throughout the 20th century. Inmates filed a class action lawsuit against the state of Ohio in the 1970s and 1980s, citing conditions that included severe overcrowding, disease, rats, inadequate food, and systematic physical abuse. The lawsuit was successful. The reformatory was ordered by a federal court to reduce its inmate population and improve conditions, and when it proved unable to do so adequately, it was closed in 1990, just 3 years before filming began. The building that served as the cinematic stand-in for Shawshank was itself a real institution that had been shut down by a court because its conditions were found to violate the constitutional prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. The fictional corruption and brutality depicted in the film were, in a very direct sense, historically present in the actual building where the cameras were rolling. After filming was completed, most of the reformatory complex was demolished as originally planned. However, a group of film enthusiasts formed the Mansfield Reformatory Preservation Society, and in the year 2000 purchased the remaining administration building and cell blocks from the state of Ohio for the sum of $1. They undertook the preservation and maintenance of the site as a historical landmark, recognizing both its significance as a genuine piece of prison history and its status as a filming location. Today the site draws enormous numbers of visitors annually. Estimates have suggested as many as 80,000 per year, as part of what has been informally called the Shawshank Trail, a tourist route through Mansfield and the surrounding area that includes other filming locations from the movie, including the courthouse and the field where Red finds Andy's letter. A 2019 report estimated that the Shawshank tourism economy was generating approximately $16 million in annual revenue for the Mansfield region. A film that was made partly because the location was cheap and available, on a building that was scheduled for demolition, became one of the most significant cultural tourism assets in that part of Ohio. The famous oak tree from the film, the one under which Andy buries his tin box and letter for Red, located at Malabar Farm State Park in Ohio, became a pilgrimage destination in its own right. Thousands of visitors traveled specifically to see that tree. In 2011, lightning struck and partially split it. News of the damage was reported internationally, which in itself tells you something about the cultural weight the film had accumulated by that point. In 2016, strong winds finished what the lightning had started and the tree was completely felled. It was finally cut down in April 2017, and its wood was turned into memorabilia, including small rock hammers, which were sold to fans. A piece of a tree that appeared briefly in a movie made 20 years earlier was valuable enough to be commercially harvested for souvenirs. That is a measure of cultural impact that very few films ever achieve. The film and American prison culture. The Shawshank Redemption arrived in 1994 at a particular moment in the history of American criminal justice policy. The early 1990s were characterized by what historians and policy analysts have called a period of mass incarceration in the United States, a dramatic and sustained expansion of the prison population driven by mandatory minimum sentencing laws, the war on drugs, and a political culture in which being perceived as tough on crime was a significant electoral advantage. The American prison population had been growing rapidly since the 1970s, and by 1994 the United States was well on its way to becoming the country with the highest per capita incarceration rate in the world, a position it would hold for decades. The political and media discourse around crime and punishment was dominated by the idea of incarceration as the primary response to criminal behavior, with rehabilitation receiving little serious attention or funding. Into this environment came a film that placed its audience inside the perspective of a prisoner, not a monster, not a caricature, but a human being with an interior life, friendships, intellectual curiosity, and an entirely legitimate grievance against the system that held him. This was an unusual choice. The dominant cultural representation of prisons and prisoners in American popular entertainment of the period tended toward either brutal exploitation, prisons as places of hyper-masculine violence where only the strongest survived, or the kind of procedural crime drama that kept the audience firmly on the side of the law enforcement apparatus. The Shawshank Redemption did neither. It asked the audience to understand incarceration from the inside, to feel the weight of it, to recognize the humanity of people the system had classified and disposed of. The film's portrayal of institutionalization, the process by which long-term imprisonment strips a person of the psychological tools needed to function in the outside world, was not merely dramatic invention. The character of Brooks Hatlin, who spends 50 years inside Shawshank and cannot survive his release, represents a phenomenon that has been documented in criminological and psychological literature with considerable consistency. People who have spent decades under the total institutional control of a prison, where every decision, from when to eat to when to sleep to when to speak, is made for them by an external authority, frequently experience profound difficulty when that authority is removed. The outside world is too loud, too fast, too unstructured, too full of choices that a person who has not made a meaningful choice in years cannot navigate. Brooks's story was not invented. It was observed, and dramatized, and given a face and a name, and that is what makes it so devastating to watch. Red's narration after Brooks's death, his recognition that what happened to Brooks could happen to any of them, including himself, carries the particular weight of a man confronting a truth he has known for a long time but has not wanted to fully examine. The film's depiction of wrongful conviction also speaks directly to a subject with deep historical roots in the American justice system. Andy Dufresne is innocent of the crime for which he is imprisoned, and no mechanism within the system is able or willing to recognize or correct this. He cannot get a fair hearing once he has been convicted. The evidence that could exonerate him is suppressed by the warden who benefits from keeping him confined. The state has no interest in revisiting a settled case. The only resolution available to him is one he engineers himself, outside the law, using the same financial skills the system has been exploiting for years. Since 1989, the Innocence Project in the United States has used DNA evidence to exonerate hundreds of wrongly convicted people, many of whom had served decades in prison, and the pattern of those exonerations has demonstrated that wrongful conviction is not a rare aberration but a systemic feature of a justice system that, under pressure to close cases and secure convictions, sometimes convicts the wrong person and then defends that conviction against later evidence. Andy Dufresne's situation is fictional. The phenomenon it represents is not. The film's theological and philosophical dimensions. One of the more fascinating aspects of the film's cultural reception is the degree to which it has been read as a religious or quasi-religious text by audiences who were not necessarily looking for that kind of content. The Christian symbolism in the film is pervasive enough that it is difficult to dismiss as accidental, even though Frank Darabont has stated in interviews that the Christian interpretations of Andy's character were largely unintentional, and that while he finds those readings interesting and valid, he did not set out to make a film with a specific theological message. The case for reading Andy Dufresne as a Christ figure is not subtle. He is a man who is innocent of the crime for which he is condemned. He descends into a kind of hell, the prison, with all its darkness, violence, and degradation, and endures its torments with a patience and composure that those around him find almost supernatural. He brings light and hope to the people around him in conditions designed to extinguish both. His escape involves crawling through what Red describes as a river of filth and emerging, reborn, on the other side, a moment that carries unmistakable baptismal imagery. The poster concealing his tunnel features a succession of women, Rita Hayworth, Marilyn Monroe, Raquel Welch, whose progressive replacement suggests the passage of time and the shedding of the material world. His eventual triumph involves the exposure of a corrupt religious hypocrite, Warden Norton, who quotes scripture while committing crimes, and his disappearance to a place of warmth and peace by the ocean. The film's ending, with Red walking across a beach toward his friend, has been interpreted by some viewers as an image of heaven, a reunion in a promised land reached after years of endurance and suffering. Film critic Roger Ebert, one of the most thoughtful defenders of the film, argued that it was fundamentally an allegory for maintaining one's sense of self-worth in a hopeless situation, that Andy's integrity was the film's true subject, and that the prison setting was the most extreme possible version of the conditions that defeat self-worth in ordinary life. From this perspective, the film speaks to anyone who has felt trapped in circumstances, a bad job, a difficult relationship, an economic situation, a social role, that seemed impossible to escape. The film critic Mark Kermode offered a different philosophical reading, suggesting that Zihuatanejo represents not heaven but a Nietzschean kind of freedom achieved outside conventional moral categories, a place beyond guilt and punishment, where Andy can finally exist without the weight of what has been done to him. These competing interpretations, the Christian redemptive reading, the existentialist reading, the allegorical reading about institutional power and individual resistance, are not mutually exclusive, and the fact that the film supports all of them simultaneously is part of what gives it such enduring intellectual and emotional richness. The word redemption in the title carries all of these meanings at once. Redemption has a theological meaning, the recovery of something lost, the payment of a debt, salvation from sin. It has a secular meaning, the improvement of one's situation, the reclaiming of dignity, the transformation of suffering into something meaningful. And it has a specifically financial meaning, the act of exchanging one thing for another, of cashing in what you have accumulated for something of greater value. Andy redeems himself in all three senses. He recovers his freedom and his dignity. He transforms 19 years of patient endurance into the specific, methodical plan that destroys Norton's corruption and secures his escape. And he literally redeems Randall Stevens's financial accounts, withdrawing the accumulated money before disappearing across the border. The title contains the whole film inside it, if you read it carefully enough. The film's journey from flop to cultural phenomenon. The cultural history of The Shawshank Redemption is itself one of the more remarkable stories in American cinema, because the film's journey from commercial failure to beloved classic maps almost perfectly onto the story it tells. A film about patient endurance, about a thing of genuine quality that the world fails to recognize at first, that waits and then emerges into the sunlight on its own terms. This is precisely what happened to the movie itself. It is difficult to know whether Darabont appreciated the irony at the time, but it is hard to miss in retrospect. When the film opened in September 1994, it competed against Forrest Gump, which was in the middle of a 42-week theatrical run and would ultimately gross $330 million. It also competed with Pulp Fiction, which opened the same week and brought an entirely different kind of cinematic energy, stylistically dazzling, violently entertaining, culturally electrifying in a way that made Shawshank's quiet emotional register seem almost old-fashioned by comparison. In that competitive environment, a slow, meditative, nearly 2.5-hour film about a man in prison, without action sequences or female characters or the kind of plot mechanics that get people through the door in large numbers, was always going to struggle. It struggled accordingly. The Washington Post called it a fairy tale, and said the inmates were cute pushovers. It closed after 10 weeks with $16 million against a $25 million budget. Then the Academy Award nominations came in, 7 of them, including Best Picture. The re-release earned another $12 million. And then the film hit home video. In 1995, it became the most rented video in the United States. Ted Turner's cable networks, particularly TNT and TBS, began airing it regularly, and because it was the kind of film that compelled people to stop and watch once they encountered it, it accumulated enormous numbers of repeat viewers through the late 1990s. By 1998, it had risen to the top of the IMDb user ratings, a position it has held, with occasional brief interruptions from The Godfather, ever since. Darabont has compared this trajectory to what happened with The Wizard of Oz and Casablanca, films that did not immediately announce themselves as classics but became so through repeated broadcasts to successive generations of television audiences who made them part of the furniture of their emotional lives. In 2015, the United States Library of Congress selected The Shawshank Redemption for preservation in the National Film Registry, the body of films determined to be culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant to America's cinematic heritage. Darabont responded to the announcement by saying he could think of no greater honor than for the film to be considered part of the country's cinematic legacy. The same year, the American Film Institute included it in its list of the 100 best American films ever made. It is now studied in university film programs, discussed in academic journals on criminology and prison reform, used in educational contexts to raise questions about justice and institutionalization, and referenced in virtually every serious conversation about what makes a film genuinely great rather than merely popular. Tim Robbins has spoken about visiting prisons through his Actors Gang Prison Project and encountering Shawshank's influence in the most immediate possible way. The prisoners he has worked with love the film deeply. Morgan Freeman, with characteristic dry wit, noted at their reunion screening that the guards, by contrast, tend not to be quite as enthusiastic about it. This small observation contains within it the entire cultural argument of the film. It is a story told from inside the walls, not outside them, and what you make of it depends fundamentally on which side of the door you are standing on when you encounter it. Hope as a cultural idea and why it resonated so deeply. The cultural staying power of The Shawshank Redemption ultimately comes down to a single idea that the film returns to again and again with patience and conviction. Hope is not naive. In a cultural environment, and the 1990s were a decade of considerable cultural cynicism, particularly about large institutions and the systems that govern public life. The reflex was to treat hope as the province of the simple-minded, the sentimental, or those who had not yet encountered enough reality to know better. The film pushes back against this with everything it has. Andy Dufresne is not naive. He is one of the most clear-eyed, strategically intelligent, and unsentimental characters in American cinema. He understands exactly where he is, and what kind of place it is and what it is doing to the people around him. And he chooses hope anyway, not because he is unaware of the reality, but because he has made a judgment that the alternative, which is what happens to Red and to Brooks and to the others who have surrendered to the institution, is not an acceptable outcome for a human being to accept. This is why the film has been reported to have changed the lives of viewers in ways that go beyond ordinary entertainment. People have written to Darabont saying that watching the film helped them leave abusive relationships, pursue education they had given up on, find courage for decisions they had been putting off for years. The film's most famous line, "Get busy living or get busy dying," is not a piece of cinematic dialogue so much as a piece of moral instruction, delivered with the authority of a man who has earned the right to say it by having lived inside the worst possible conditions for the alternative. When Andy says it, the audience believes it, because they have watched what it cost him to arrive at that conviction. And that belief, that genuine, earned, cinematically produced belief, is what the film has been generating in audiences around the world for 30 years. It is, in the end, what culture is for. The film's place in the broader history of prison cinema. The history of prison films in America goes back to the earliest decades of cinema. Films like I Am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang in 1932 used the prison setting to make direct social arguments about the injustice of the American penal system, and they were genuinely controversial at the time. Through the mid-20th century, prison films tended to fall into fairly established patterns: the tough guy hero navigating a world of violence, the escape thriller, the wrongful conviction drama. By the 1980s and early 1990s, the genre had developed a reputation for gratuitous violence and exploitation, and audience enthusiasm for prison films was, as noted earlier, declining by the time Shawshank was released. What Darabont did with the genre was fundamentally different from what most prison films attempted. He was explicit in interviews about his inspirations, and they were not other prison films. They were Frank Capra's films, particularly It's a Wonderful Life and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Films about good people in impossible situations, films with a frank emotional generosity that did not apologize for caring about their characters. Darabont described The Shawshank Redemption not as a prison movie but as a tall tale, a story that presents itself as completely real while containing elements that could not quite have happened the way described, told by a narrator who was there and who needs you to believe him. The genre label of prison film, in his view, was incidental. The story was about something older and more fundamental than institutional settings or genre conventions. The film that came closest to Shawshank's spirit in the same era was Darabont's own follow-up Stephen King adaptation, The Green Mile, released in 1999. That film also used an institutional setting, a death row prison block, to tell a story about human dignity, spiritual grace, and the capacity of extraordinary individuals to transform the people around them. Both films suggest that Darabont's artistic preoccupation is less with prisons as social institutions and more with prisons as extreme environments that reveal, with unusual clarity, what human beings are made of when stripped of everything except their essential character. In that sense, The Shawshank Redemption belongs not just to the history of prison cinema but to a much older tradition, the literature of captivity, endurance, and spiritual survival that runs from ancient texts through the prison writings of Dostoevsky to the concentration camp memoirs of Viktor Frankl. A tradition in which the act of maintaining one's humanity under conditions designed to destroy it is recognized as one of the most profound and meaningful things a person can do.